Hi and welcome back. In this video, we're going to look at Flask-JWT-Extended, and we're going to do login. Up to now, we've been using Flask-JWT to do login via the /auth endpoint that it creates for us. Let's go here into app.py to remind ourselves how this all works. We import Flask-JWT, which gives us this JWT class, and then when we create that, we give it our app and the authenticate and identity functions, and it does some magic there to link up the app with the auth endpoint that it's going to create and uses the authenticate and identity functions. In addition, there's a little bit of magic going on in the background that Flask-JWT is doing, and this has been the source of some confusion for a lot of you. So JWT, as soon as it's created, uses our app to add a new endpoint, and it uses these two functions in that endpoint. So let's go over to security.py where these functions are defined, and we've got the authenticate function. When you send the username and password to the /auth endpoint, it takes in those two and essentially finds a user in the database and checks the password to make sure it's correct, and then it returns the user back to the Flask-JWT. If the login is valid and it returns none, that's the default return value for any Python function, returns none if the authentication failed. That's how Flask-JWT knows whether the username and password were correct or not. Then Flask-JWT is going to create the JWT token, and in the JWT it's going to save some data. The data is the user ID, and that is defined inside Flask-JWT. So the user's ID property, it's gonna actually try to get the user ID. It's gonna try to get the user ID and put it in the JWT and encrypt it so it's safe, and returns that. That is saved as the identity key in the JWT. So when we decrypt it, which comes back as the identity function when we make another request, we access the user's ID as the payload's identity key. So this is when we make another request and we send the JWT to our API. Using identity, we can get the user ID, and then we can return what user model that ID corresponds to, and in the rest of our app, Flask-JWT can then use this user model that we've returned if we want. We've not quite looked at how to use the user model in our app, but there are ways of doing it. Now, Flask-JWT-Extended requires a little bit more code because it doesn't have that magic in the background doing things for you. Now, it doesn't do things for you, which can be bad, but at the same time, it actually becomes more explicit. It becomes clearer what it's doing and what it's not doing because you are telling it exactly what should happen. So I actually quite like Flask-JWT-Extended, and in this video, we're going to learn how to do the login. So let's go ahead and delete security.py. We're not going to need security.py any longer, so we can move it to the trash, get rid of it, and of course, we are going to go to app.py, and we are going to add here Flask-JWT-Extended. We are going to import a JWT manager in here. Okay. The JWT manager actually doesn't have to do much. All it has to do is link up to the app. Once it links up to the app, it can sort of know a bit of what's going on in your app. For example, to only live inside a request. That means that when you get some data from the user, Flask-JWT-Extended will be able to determine that you have received the request, and it will be able to give you data regarding the user that made that request if you request it, if you want that data. So that's why we're linking the JWT manager with our app. And notice, of course, that JWT manager, part of Flask-JWT-Extended, this no longer has anything to do with Flask-JWT. Completely different libraries. Everything's completely different, essentially. That's the only change we need to do in app.py. But of course, this is not creating the auth endpoint. This doesn't use the authenticate and identity functions, which indeed don't exist any longer, so I actually have to delete them. This does not create an authentication endpoint. We have to create that endpoint ourselves. So let's go ahead and create it in the user resource. Here we've got the user register resource that allows us to create new users and put them into the database. And we've got the user resource that we've used to to retrieve and delete users. So we're going to minimize this one as well, just to give it a bit more room. And we're going to create a user login resource. The user login is going to do exactly what the authenticate function did before. Going to take in a username and password, and it's going to make sure that they are correct. Okay? So we are going to have, of course, we're going to have a parser that we're going to need because we need to extract the username and password. So we're going to create that first. And then we're just going to have a post method in here. This post method is going to do a few things. It's going to get data from parser. Then it's going to find the user in the database. Then it's going to check the password. And then it's going to do something that the authenticate function did not do because Flask-JWT did for us. It's going to create an access token. And it's also going to create a refresh token. And we will look at this later. Okay? Don't worry too much about the refresh token just now. For now, the access token is the JWT that Flask-JWT was creating. And then, of course, it's going to return them. And that's it. Let's start from the beginning. Let's get some data using the parser. Well, all we have to do is say data equal self.parser.parse args. We know how to do this, or indeed, if you wanted, you could do user login.parser.parse args. Totally the same thing. Doesn't really matter. And by the way, this could be a class method if you wanted. It may actually be better if this is a class method. Then this can be a CLS, and this can be CLS2. There you go. Now we've got the data, we can go ahead and find a user in the database. So user is userModel.find by username, and we're going to use the data coming back from the parser. So it's going to be data username, like that. Okay. So now that we have this data, this user model, we can go ahead and check the password. We're going to do this in the same way that the authenticate function did earlier on. So if the user exists and save string compare, this is coming from workzoig, user.password and data.password. So just going to compare those two. And of course, we have to import this. We'll do that in just a moment. Then we are going to create an access token. We're going to say access token is create access token. Okay, so what is this create access token? Well, this is part of Flask-JWT-Extended. This is what actually creates that JWT that is going to allow users to send it back to us to tell us who they are. And in telling us who they are, we need to have some data stored in the JWT that will allow us to identify that user. That's what the identity function did in the security.py file before. Now we just put it here. Identity is user.id. We're also going to say fresh equal true. And again, don't worry about that just now. We're going to look at it in just a couple of videos. This has to do with token refreshing. Okay. Similarly, we're also going to create a refresh token, which is going to be create refresh token, and the identity is going to be user.id. Okay. So I'm going to delete those two comments, and then we're going to return them. So the access token is going to be the access token, and the refresh token is going to be the refresh token. The code is 200, which is a default, but nonetheless, it's always a good idea to put that in there. Okay, now if the user didn't exist or the password is wrong, we can also return a nice message there to say something like message invalid credentials. And the code for this is going to be 401. That means unauthorized. Okay, I'm going to delete these comments just to make it a little bit nicer there. And that's it. So again, just a small comment for you. This is what the authenticate function used to do. Check the user exists and the password is correct. And this identity equal is what the identity function used to do. But now, instead of saving the user's ID by default into the JWT and then having our identity function extract it, we are saving that user ID into the access token as the identity. Then we can retrieve it if we want. And I'll teach you how to do that very soon as well. Okay, so now we have this user login resource. A small optimization here, by the way. We've got the same parser in the user register and the user login resources, so we can actually extract it and move it outside the resources. And that's just going to be a little bit nicer. So I'm going to rename this. Oh, was a bit too quick there. There you have it. We're going to rename this to _user parser. Oh, maybe I can't do that. _user parser. Sorry about that. I tried something, but it didn't quite work there. So we're going to do this like that. And here we're going to do the same. Just format this a bit more nicely. Now we have this _user _parser. The reason why I'm making it underscore is just so it tells whoever wants to import things from user.py that this is a private variable and you shouldn't import it from somewhere else. That's what the underscore at the start means in Python. So now we have a little bit less code duplication because we can go ahead into the user register resource and do that instead of using the user register parser. And the reason why I said it doesn't really matter what you do here with self or CLS is because we're actually going to delete that too. And we are going to use the user parser in there too. Just removing a bit of duplication is always a good idea to do that. Now we've got a single parser that is used to parse the arguments coming into the request. The way this works, by the way, is when you define the parser, you are not really getting any data from a request. All you're saying is data coming in is going to have these two pieces of data inside it. When you are inside this post method, that means the fact that you're running this means that a user has sent you, and by the way, we don't need that. That means that a user has sent you some data. The fact that you're running this means the user has sent you some data, so when you run user parser.parse args, that's going to get that data that's come through the request, and it's going to parse it, and it's going to try to see where the username and password are stored in the request, and it's going to get that data out and give it to you as a dictionary. Okay, we don't need those things. Those were just artifacts from before. That's our user login resource created. As you can see, it's very sort of Python code. It doesn't have any magical stuff. We parse the data, we find the user, then we compare the passwords, and then we create our access token or refresh token. And everything happens here in this function. It doesn't happen all over the place like it did with Flask-JWT. Now we have to import a few things like safe string compare, create access token, create refresh token. So let's do that just now. We're going to go here and from workzoig.security, we're going to import safe strcmp, and from Flask-JWT-Extended, we're going to import create access token and create refresh token. Okay, those things are coming from Flask-JWT-Extended, and again, we're able to do this in here and create a valid access token because the Flask-JWT-Extended is linked to our app because of what we did up here. The JWTs are going to get some information from our app as well when they're created, so that's always nice to do. Now, going back to our app.py, we have to import the user login resource, of course, and add it in. So we're going to do API add resource, and we're going to do user login, and this is going to be login. Okay, you can call this auth if you want, but I'm just going to call it login to really hammer the point home that this is a different thing than Flask-JWT was. Okay. Also, Flask-JWT comes with its own set of app.config settings. Instead of app.secret-key, here you can use, if you want, app.config JWT secret key, because this value here, Jose, is used to encrypt the JWT. So if you want to keep your app's secret key and your JWT secret key different for security reasons, you can do that by setting this configuration property. Okay. Now, of course, we have to do one last thing, which is modify our requirements.txt. Instead of Flask-JWT, install Flask-JWT-Extended. And if you open up your terminal, which I have open here, we're going to do pip install Flask-JWT-Extended. All right, it's already installed in this virtual environment, but if you don't have it already installed, it will install it for you. Now you should be able to run app.py and it won't tell you any errors. Okay, that's good. The last thing to do is to go over to our item resource, which is the only other part of our code that used Flask-JWT up here, and just change this to Flask-JWT-Extended. JWT required is still the same thing, except it's no longer decorator with arguments, so it doesn't need the function call at the end. So that's important. If you import JWT required from Flask-JWT-Extended, make sure to use the decorator without the brackets at the end. Okay, and that's it. That's the only place where we were using Flask-JWT. So in order still to run the get endpoint of the item resource, we still need to provide an access token, the JWT. Okay, so that hasn't changed. Now, you can try running your app and testing it with Postman, but you're going to find that it won't quite just work out of the box. There are a couple more changes we have to make, so let's make them in the next video. I'll see you there.